Welcome everyone to today's webinar, co-hosted by the Social Impact Measurement and the Systems and Evaluation Topical Interest Groups of the American Evaluation Association. I'm Heather Esper. It's nice to see you today, whether you're here in person or watching this later as a recording. I'm the chair of the SIMTIG, and we're very delighted today to be hosting our first webinar with another TIG, and we hope it's the first of many with the Systems and Evaluation TIG. And we also, this is kind of like a pop-up TIG where one of our members wanted to do some feedback on some work that they're doing. And so it was kind of a quick turnaround, and we're hoping to do more of those. So if you have interest in doing something like this in the future, please let us know. This was really quick. We turned it around in a week. So that is possible. So for those of you that are not familiar, the American Evaluation Association is a professional association of evaluators devoted to the application and exploration of evaluation as a profession. We have over 6,000 members representing all 50 states, as well as more than 80 foreign countries. And in the chat, I put a little link to the evaluation organization. And then within the AEA, there are a bunch of different TIGs, and we are the Social Impact Measurement TIG. We're a group of members who are interested in the topic of social impact measurement and management, and exploring the interplay between social and financial return of investments. We come from all different types of backgrounds, from evaluators to evaluation commissioners, investors to investees. And membership in our TIG means that you want to learn more about evaluating the social impact of organizations that are aiming to both produce a social and a financial return. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim, who is here from the Systems and Evaluation TIG, to give a little introduction to her group. Thanks. Kim, if you're speaking, you're on mute. I'm having a little bit of a technical difficulty. I can't hear you, Kim. In the interest of, I can go ahead and introduce the Systems and Evaluation TIG so that everyone can get a little bit more of an understanding of what they're up to. And Kim, if she gets audio, can jump in and share some more. They focus on finding ways to incorporate a systems perspective into evaluations. And they find that social impact investment programs occur within complex and open systems. That is, with many interacting components and stakeholders' values and interests, and that are affected by factors beyond their control, like climate or new policies as well. So they focus on designs and methods that account for a few different things. First, diverse perspectives. Second, system boundaries and external influences. Third, component and stakeholder interconnectedness and mapping. Fourth, system dynamics, such as barriers or reinforcing feedback loops that could affect how evaluations can be focused for key learning or data that emerges, and how, by, and for whom findings are interpreted and used. So for those SIMTIG members on the call, you can be a part of multiple TIGs, and I'm actually a part of the Systems and Evaluation TIG as well. And I hope we have some more cross membership between the two TIGs, because I think there's a lot of overlap. I see John here too. He's also involved in both TIGs, I believe. So now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Slavi to introduce one of our webinar co-chairs to introduce our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. Hi, everyone. My name is Slavi Stevanovic. I'm managing partner of Catalyst Research Group based in Vancouver, British Columbia, on unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people. I'm also a co-coordinator of SIMTIG webinar. I second Heather in welcoming Jackson Gates to our webinar series. We have a very exciting webinar for you today, focused on getting started on system mapping for investors. Detail on our next webinar is forthcoming, so stay tuned. We're hoping to have one in September, but we'll give you more information very soon. Now, without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. We're very lucky to have with us Jackson Gates. Jackson is a research and content development manager at Impact Frontiers. In addition to working directly with investors through Impact Frontiers cohort programs, Jackson served as the project lead on Impact Frontiers online curriculum on impact financial integration and is working on Investor Contribution 2.0. Jackson will be leaving Impact Frontiers on July 7 to begin a very exciting, I'm sure, dual degree program at Harvard Kennedy School and MIT's Sloan School of Management. Congratulations, Jackson. I'm sure this is really exciting. So as part of his work at Impact Frontiers today, he's looking to solicit feedback on emerging thinking on how investors can integrate system mapping techniques into decision-making process at investment as well as portfolio levels. This feedback will be integrated back into the white paper that it will be published in July. So without further ado, Jackson, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, all. And thank you for making this time. As Slavi said, my name is Jackson Gates, and I'm a research and content development manager at Impact Frontiers. There are two branches of our work at Impact Frontiers. One part is working directly with investors on how to set up decision-making processes that optimize performance for their particular impact and financial goals. And the other part is exploring frontier topics in impact management where established guidance doesn't yet exist. We used industry consensus building processes with practitioners and subject experts to explore these topics. This presentation and the accompanying white paper that will be published in early July are a part of that second branch. They represent our emerging thinking on how investors might integrate systems mapping techniques into decision-making processes. The purpose of this presentation is to solicit input and feedback from practitioners like you all on this thinking, which will then integrate into the paper in the hopes of offering investors a way to get started with systems mapping. So this is our run of show today. We'll start by setting some systems mapping terminology that may be familiar for some folks, but is helpful to recap for the purposes of this presentation, and do a brief review of systems mapping methods, how they work and what they're used for. Then we'll compare and contrast the ways that systems mapping and theories of change portray how change happens and consider some of the potential implications for decision-making. Then we'll look at one way that investors might integrate systems mapping into decision-making using theories of change at the investment level and portfolio level. But the whole point is to hear and learn from you all, so I'll try to leave plenty of time for discussion at the end. Okay, before we get into how investors can integrate systems mapping into decision-making, we'll start by establishing that common language. Before we get into the what of systems mapping, though, this quote from Ian Boyd, a biology professor at the University of St. Andrews and the former chief scientific advisor at the UK's Department of Energy, captures the why really nicely. He says, just about everywhere you look, there are examples of interconnected networks of nodes, whether they be causal factors, people, organisms, or actors. The dynamic relationships between these define everything from how ecosystems function to political, social, and financial networks. If we are ever to be able to constructively manage these systems, we first need to be able to define their state, and this involves a process of systems mapping. So as a methodology, we can think about systems mapping as a way to investigate the way that change happens in complex systems and use that understanding to advance our goals. So it's helpful to think about systems mapping as an umbrella term that's used to refer to a wide variety of different methodologies and practices. In this presentation, systems mapping will broadly refer to the process of constructing a visual model of the causal relationships in a system. Like any map or model, a systems map is a purposeful simplification of the thing it represents. What gets included in and excluded from that simplification depends on the purpose of the map. Some maps include roads and exclude topography, and others do the opposite. Different kinds of systems maps make different choices about what to include and exclude, but all of them tend to share three common features: elements, causal relationships, and a boundary. Before we get into what those mean, it's worth noting that in a systems mapping context, the word system can be applied to almost anything. You can map a household as a system, a government as a system, a classroom as a system, the global economy as a system. In a systems mapping context, it's less important to think about what can and cannot be called a system, and more important to recognize that calling something a system means you'll be analyzing it in terms of its component parts and the way that they interact with one another, and that you'll have to decide on a boundary, what you're going to include and exclude as participants in that system. Okay, the other key terms: elements. This term will refer to the things that interact or affect one another in the system. Again, there's often a lot of flexibility here, though some approaches have stricter rules about what can and cannot function as an element in the map. Sometimes these are more narrowly defined as variables, so that it makes sense to say that they increase or decrease, but some systems maps don't define their elements this way, depending on what their intended purpose is. Boundary. This can be defined explicitly in terms of a geographic boundary, for instance, and or implicitly by which elements are included and which are excluded. Causal relationships. At a minimum, these indicate which system elements affect and are affected by each other. Systems maps can also include additional information about how they affect one another. They might differentiate between positive and negative causal relationships when elements change in the same or opposite directions as one another, the time horizon they operate on, and the relative strength and or likelihood. This is the prose, but it's helpful to ground these terms in some examples. So this is a systems map of a social enterprise's business-related and mission-related activities. We won't walk through the whole map. For now, we're just going to use it to illustrate the terms we just walked through. The elements here are the terms in smaller fonts: competitive advantage, resource accumulation, support from community bodies, etc. We can ignore things like revenue generation and organizational legitimacy for now. These are labels for subsystems within the broader system. The causal relationships here are the arrows between elements. This map differentiates between positive and negative causal relationships. For this particular social enterprise, for instance, social action has a negative causal relationship with the level of outstanding community need. An increase in social action causes a decrease in the level of outstanding community need. The level of outstanding community need, on the other hand, has a positive causal relationship with social action. If the level of outstanding community need increases, this particular social enterprise's social action increases, and vice versa. The boundary of this system is defined implicitly by which elements are included and excluded. Government programs and policy, for instance, are not in this map, which tells us that they are not a part of the way this map defines this system. Okay, two more terms that will come up later on in the presentation: system structure and system behavior. System structure will refer to the way that the elements in a system are connected to one another. A system structure can tell us some important things, but it doesn't on its own allow us to make forward-looking predictions about how elements will change over time, or how an intervention in one of the elements will propagate through the rest of the system. We'll refer to those forward-looking considerations as the system's behavior. For that, we need more information than we have here about the causal relationships in the system. For instance, we don't know how an influx of new community need and a decline in the social reputation of this enterprise's organizational partners will shake out. It may be that an influx of new community need triggers more social action and therefore an increase in organizational legitimacy that offsets a decline in the partner's reputation, and therefore that decline does not result in less capital available to the enterprise. So this map is set up to analyze the system's structure, but not necessarily its behavior. Here's a different example. This is a systems map of the bio-based energy economy in the United Kingdom's Humber region. We've got all of the same building blocks, but this map differentiates between the relative strength of the different causal relationships in the map. Now we can start to think about what might happen if there was an exogenous intervention in the system, how the system might behave. because we can see which downstream effects may be larger and smaller. In other words, differentiating between the causal relationships in this way allows us to analyze both the structure and the behavior of this system. So we can start to see how the kind of information you build into a system map affects how you can use it. We can arrange these considerations along a spectrum, with qualitative systems maps on one end and quantitative maps on the other. Qualitative maps generally are not used for forward-looking analyses and are therefore comparatively less sensitive to imperfect and/or incomplete information. Building more quantitative maps tends to come with more data requirements for computational predictions, because those predictions are extremely sensitive to the underlying data. Our first example was a qualitative system map, because it didn't differentiate between the relative strength of the causal relationships. Our second example was what we'll refer to as a semi-quantitative systems map. This map was built from qualitative data. Researchers gathered the information that went into the map through workshops with system stakeholders, and then translated that qualitative data into quantitative heuristics about the relative strength of the causal relationships. Semi-quantitative maps can be interpreted qualitatively by considering how a system will behave based on which causal pathways are stronger and which are weaker, or quantitatively by taking the extra step of assigning state values to the elements and then running a computational simulation. Qualitative and semi-quantitative systems maps are typically built from similar kinds of information. The decision about which map ultimately to produce depends on how important forward-looking analyses are for the mapper and how confident they are in their ability to reliably differentiate between the causal relationships based on the information that they have. Then we have quantitative systems maps. These are explicitly built for computational predictive analysis and are typically the domain of highly trained technical experts working with large amounts of quantitative data. This is an example of a quantitative system map of the effect of pollution on tourism in the Maldives. It was built to predict how things like prices would change over time in response to changes in pollution levels. So on the left, you can see that this systems map predicted an accelerating increase in prices over time. Prices are over here on the right. That prediction on the left is the output of a computer simulation that was based on the initial quantitative values assigned to each element and each causal relationship, which together set in motion changes over time in each of the variables, which are represented on the left. Now, there's a lot more that can be said about the differences between these approaches, how they're built, how they're analyzed, and so on. It's important to be clear that quantitative maps are not necessarily better than qualitative maps. Different contexts call for different approaches. I'm happy to share resources and further reading after the session with folks who are interested, but for now, the main point is to provide a general sense of what the terms qualitative and semi-quantitative systems mapping will refer to. Okay, so where and how are these methods relevant for investors? Systems mapping has traditionally been the domain of academics and policymakers, but the way in which people describe the rationale and use cases for systems mapping echoes a lot of the way that impact-driven enterprises and investors talk about theories of change. Both are ways of explicitly articulating and examining how we think change will happen. But there are important differences between them too. Investors have expressed reservations about using traditional theories of change to describe how change happens in complex systems contexts, and are more and more using systems thinking to consider alternative ways to think about their impact goals. Now, the term theory of change, like systems mapping, is an umbrella term that encompasses a wide variety of different practices. In general, though, theories of change articulate a cause and effect logic that connects an organization's activities to their goals. Michael Brown from the Wharton ESG Initiative, who I believe is on this webinar, identified 4 different questions that explicitly articulating and examining this cause and effect logic can help organizations consider. What is the intervention trying to achieve? How realistic is the intervention's goal? How does the intervention align with best practices? How does the intervention work? Going through the exercise of explicitly articulating the causal logic behind how an organization expects their activities to result in their intended impacts can help investors reflect on these kinds of questions. So if this 4-part framework more or less covers the why, for what purposes organizations develop theories of change, let's take a closer look at the how, the cause and effect logic. Many theories of change use what we'll refer to as a sequential causal logic, where an organization's activities cause some change A leads to B leads to C, and C leads to their target impact. This is sometimes referred to as the causal pathway between an organization's activities and their goals, where the theory of change describes the domino effect of changes that an organization's activities are intended to set in motion with the ultimate aim of causing their intended impact on stakeholder outcomes. This kind of causal logic suggests the transitive property. If the activities cause A causes B causes C, and C causes the intended impact, then our activities will have their intended effect. Organizations can then examine each causal linkage to evaluate the likelihood that their activities result in their goals. In doing so, theory of change practitioners often highlight the importance of considering external factors that might disrupt the intended causal pathway. This is what the IMP consensus referred to as external impact risk, the probability that external factors disrupt an organization's ability to deliver their intended impact. This kind of impact risk recognizes that the organization's activities are often not the only dynamic force in their operating environment. Considering the likelihood of each of the causal linkages in the theory of change can help surface these kinds of risks. This, though, is where the limitations of sequential causal logic start to become apparent. It can surface contextual factors that can affect the intended causal pathway, but it's not so good at helping you consider how. It's difficult to represent and critically examine these dynamic interactions between the intended causal pathway and external factors in a neat, linear, sequential causal logic. These interactions also raise what the IMP called unexpected impact risk, the possibility that significant unexpected impact is experienced by people and/or the planet. Once we start to think about how this causal pathway interacts with the external environment, we start to realize that an organization's impact may not be so narrowly contained to the causal pathway described by the theory of change. As a framework for evaluating the likelihood that an organization has its intended impact, then, using a sequential causal logic to build a theory of change can make it hard to examine and incorporate external and unexpected impact risks into decision-making processes. The more we consider these interactions, the picture that starts to emerge is one in which the things we want to change are a part of a web of interconnections, and that the impact of an organization's activities can reverberate throughout that web, not just in the straight line that we describe in the sequential causal logic of many theories of change. Practitioners of theory of change rightly point out that going through the exercise of explicitly spelling out how we think change will happen can help us critically examine the assumptions about impact that might otherwise be left implicit, which can in turn lead us to make different decisions about how we go about pursuing our goals. Theories of change built with sequential causal logic can leave important parts of this task unfinished. And therein lies the bridge to systems mapping that we want to explore with you all. Now, we're venturing into more unexplored territory here. While there are examples of enterprises and policymakers using these methods in their decision-making processes, we have not come across concrete examples of investors using the specific approach we'll look at here, which is why we wanted to present it today to discuss with you all. The basic premise here is that investors can use theories of change at both the investment level and portfolio level to inform decision-making, and that systems mapping techniques can help these theories of change more explicitly integrate contextual factors and the possibility of unintended consequences into those decisions. Okay, let's start at the investment level. Investors can use investment level theories of change to consider the expected impact of an investment during due diligence and to inform impact management strategies during the ownership period. In other words, thinking back to the four-part theory of change framework we looked at earlier, this kind of theory of change is looking at what is our impact goal with this investment? Which kinds of outcomes for which kinds of stakeholders are we looking to affect with our resources? How would our capital and non-financial engagement reach those stakeholder outcomes? In a sequential causal logic form, this kind of theory of change might look something like this. In order for this investment to cause our target change in stakeholder outcomes, our capital and non-financial engagement will cause some change in this enterprise's activities, which will in turn lead to some change A, which will lead to some change B, and so on. This describes an investor's intended positive investor contribution. If we anticipate that this investment might come with external and unexpected impact risks, though, we might use semi-quantitative systems mapping to collect and organize information about those risks and consider how the change we expect to trigger in the enterprise may propagate through the environment it operates in. Doing so can help us identify and consider possible nonlinear causal pathways between the enterprise and different stakeholder outcomes, which in turn can help us think about external and unexpected impact risks. How likely is it that this investment actually reaches our target stakeholders? Might this investment have unintended consequences for our target stakeholders or other stakeholders in the system? Are there steps we can take to mitigate those risks during the ownership period? This can also help us identify knowledge gaps that might limit our ability to anticipate how our investments are likely to affect stakeholders. We discussed earlier how we tend to need more information to consider a system's behavior, which is effectively what we're doing when we want to think about the expected impact of an investment as we're considering whether or not to make that investment. Systems mapping can help us think about that relationship between what we know and how well we are able to assess the expected impact of our investments. This is what the IMP referred to as evidence risk, the probability that insufficient high-quality data exists to know what impact is occurring. As we organize what we know about the context that an enterprise operates in into this kind of systems map, we can think about things like, how confident are we that we have identified enough of the elements that may affect and or be affected by our investment? Can we reliably differentiate between the causal relationships in the map based on what we know? The answers to these questions can then help us think about evidence risk. If we realize there are significant gaps in our map, or that we aren't confident in our ability to differentiate between the causal relationships, then it might be hard for us to build a reliable semi-quantitative systems map to assess expected impacts. That doesn't mean that going through the systems mapping process was all for naught. This process, instead, helps us think more critically about the level of evidence risk associated with different investments. And we may find that we actually have a fair degree of confidence in our semi-quantitative systems map. And then we can start to look at the relative strength of the different causal pathways in the map and think about the likelihood that our investment causes our intended impact on our target stakeholders and anticipate where unintended impacts may crop up. In effect, semi-quantitative systems mapping can pick up where many theories of change leave off, as a way of thinking about those dynamic interactions that are hard to represent and examine in a sequential causal logic. In doing so, it can help us better assess impact risks when making investment decisions. Now, this raises the question of how we should think about evidence. How do we know whether we have enough evidence for semi-quantitative systems mapping? This is a difficult problem and one that often crops up in conversations about systems mapping. One way we might think about assessing the strength of our evidence comes from Rob Riccigliano, who leads the Omidyar Group's systems thinking and complexity work. He refers to this as the multiple biases principle. The basic idea is that when you're building a systems map with qualitative data, the diversity of perspectives that you engage can serve as a proxy for the strength of your evidence base. It's kind of reminiscent of the fable of the blind man and the elephant. An individual person or organization's perspective on a system may come with certain biases, but as you integrate a greater diversity of perspectives into your map, you start to get a clearer picture of the whole elephant. Each stakeholder's perspective shines a light on parts of the system that others might not be well positioned to see, and your picture of the system becomes progressively less biased as you incorporate more of those perspectives into your map. Thinking about the strength of our evidence in terms of the diversity of stakeholder perspectives that we have incorporated provides a concrete, actionable way for investors to both consider the strength of their evidence when making investment decisions and to improve it where possible by continuing to engage and integrate different stakeholders' perspectives. Now, at the portfolio level, it can get a bit trickier to build a reliable semi-quantitative systems map. Investors' portfolio level theories of change often implicitly or explicitly involve much broader, more abstract, and or more complex systems because they refer to the aggregate intended effect of individual investments. And as we zoom out at the portfolio level, there are often a lot more elements to identify, causal relationships to differentiate, and a lot more stakeholders to engage. Still, a portfolio level systems map does not necessarily need to support forward-looking analyses in order to be useful as we think about our portfolio level impact strategies. As a way of thinking about which kinds of investments are best positioned to advance our portfolio's impact goals, developing a portfolio level theory of change involves thinking about a system structure and which elements in the system may have more or less leverage over our target impacts. And we can use qualitative systems mapping to think about these things. The UK government's Office for Science provides a useful case study on this. They used a qualitative systems mapping approach to consider where policy interventions were more or less well-positioned to lower obesity rates. I've included some of their findings over here on the left and would encourage folks who are interested to check out the full report they publish, which discusses their methodology, analysis, and conclusions. Their goal was not to predict the degree of impact that a policy intervention in these elements would have on obesity. Instead, it was to identify promising opportunities for policymakers to investigate further based on the overarching structure of the system around obesity. For investors, this suggests that there may be an opportunity for portfolio level and investment level systems mapping to become mutually reinforcing processes, where investors build qualitative systems maps for their portfolio level impact goals and use them to identify elements that may have leverage over their goals. Then they can look for investment opportunities related to those elements and build semi-quantitative systems maps to consider the expected impact of those investments, and then use the results to update and refine their portfolio level systems map. In this way, an investor's portfolio level strategy would become dynamic and responsive to investment level learnings and aggregate and organize those learnings over time to help investors identify investment opportunities that best advance their portfolio level goals. And if we center stakeholder engagement in the investment level systems mapping process, this approach could also provide a channel for stakeholder voice to inform our decision-making. Because systems mapping can also highlight and force us to reckon with the power dynamics that are built into our investment decisions by showing us which stakeholders may benefit from our investments and which may not. A sequential causal logic often only shows us our intentions. Systems maps can present us with difficult choices. The roles that stakeholders' voices and power dynamics play in those choices shows up in almost every impact management conference. The image on the left here is the spectrum of community engagement, a framework for thinking about how organizations involve their stakeholders in decisions about how to improve outcomes. And the image on the right says, "Nothing about us without us is for us," which is a slogan that originated in Central European politics and became a rallying cry in disability activist movements in the 1990s. Systems mapping is not a silver bullet for these issues, but centering stakeholders in the ways that we build systems maps and incorporate them into decision-making can help us think about those choices from the perspectives of the stakeholders that experience the impact of our decisions. In working with organizations on systems mapping, Rob Riccigliano observed that systems mapping changes the mapper as much as it changes the system. It's hard, and it doesn't promise the same clarity that we get from traditional theories of change. But if we embrace that as a reflection of the work that we're engaged in, rather than a flaw in the methodology, systems mapping encourages us to engage with the stakeholders who are affected by our actions and center their experiences in the difficult choices we face about how to use our resources to empower stakeholders. And in that way, integrating systems mapping into decision-making presents as both a tactically desirable way to think about how to realize our intentions and a valuable end in and of itself. Okay, let's open it up. I'm eager to hear folks' reactions, comments, and feedback on these ideas. And I'm going to stop screen sharing just so we can all see each other, but I'm happy to pull it back up.
Thanks, Jackson. And this is Mike, also Jackson's teammate from Impact Frontiers. And I just first wanted to thank Jackson for sharing and thank all of you for being here because we're so grateful for the opportunity to have your input. One thing that I wanted to emphasize is that all of this may strike you as being very introductory level, very 101, stuff you already knew, but it's actually quite new for investors that we work with. And so our hope here is to give them enough to get started to be able to graduate to some of the kinds of more advanced techniques that all of you do. And we're grateful for the opportunity to hear from this group of experts. Are we steering people in the right direction? How would you frame it differently for for novices? What are the practices we're missing? How can we get investors pointed in the right direction just as they're getting started? Kim, I see your hand is up.
Yeah. Hi, Michael. Hi, Jackson, Peter, everybody here. My apologies for coming on late, and I appreciate that Heather was able to speak on my behalf, given that something came up here that I couldn't ignore. But I was able to hear the presentation, so that was great. I wasn't there for all the introductions. So my apologies if I'm misstating like who was doing what, but what I did really appreciate, so there's several things I appreciated about this, but one of the important ones is I'm excited to think about social investing. And I guess I just want to say impact investing, because it could be social, environmental, anything, taking on this pathway. I think coming from the ecology background, it's kind of been there a lot anyway, because we've always had to work with these open, complex systems that involve people. And in fact, the easier part was the quantitative data that you could collect that didn't involve any people. And then you got the people in there and it got everything kind of messed up. But what was being done through those techniques and through the work you're doing here is adaptive management. And you are implying here through the last slide, that this is an avenue toward that adaptive management. I think that would be, really useful to incorporate into this paper, because, and there might be some nice visual that would allow you to show that with the systems mapping. And well, I'll mention a couple things, but when you're talking about testing those uncertainties and testing those assumptions, having that systems map and going through that process together, you also can do a better job of setting up a learning agenda, prioritizing and sequencing your learning questions to do the job of reducing those uncertainties in your model. So that model sets sort of so you really can't do adaptive management without a systems model. A theory of change is insufficient for doing adaptive management. So maybe that's one of the things you could talk about if impact investors, would be interested in that approach, because it would allow them to pivot more quickly, perhaps before they put too much money into, one thing or the other. And the other thing I'll just mention is, and I'm sure you probably mentioned something like this, this would not, this is the beginning of a process that we'd anticipate would include monitoring, evaluation, again, sequencing these things, and that this does not exclude then from the picture even traditional forms of evaluation. Yes, this is a form of developmental evaluation. That's what it allows for, and adaptive management, but there is value in conducting the process related, performance related, and at times where possible, the impact evaluations, and maybe even some rapid impact evaluations, again, that allow for that adaptive management. So I guess all my feeling was this is great that it's out there. I'm hoping that this is something that can be packaged in a way that social investors who have little time will be open to hearing.
Super, super helpful. Thank you, Kim.
And Kim, are there any, one of the things we're doing is we're putting together a set of recommended readings. Are there any recommended readings that you would suggest that we put there, even as we also incorporate that concept, which I love, of adaptive management into the paper? Are there like a couple of things that we could point people to if they wanted to dig deeper?
Yes, I will send you some suggestions rather than try to fit that in here, because my mind wants to be with you. And a lot of the examples that I work from, again, emerged from the ecology field. So we want to think about examples that would be more applicable. USAID has some things out that are about adaptive management, but they're really, so far, because of the disjointedness of the way their work was put together, they come across more as how to be adaptive and not so much about what adaptive management is. but what you're offering here really would allow for real adaptive management.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Jackson, this is John Sherman, and my apologies. I've never figured out how to raise my hand on Zoom after all these years, so I'm raising my hand. So first of all, thank you. I think it was, Mike hit it on the head. This was a great 101, kind of led through the process. I think that my experience is when you're having these conversations, that bumps up into some of the realities around, for example, the stakeholder piece. And how you unpack that, because the next step is it's to show kind of what all the possible levels of stakeholder engagement, and then what does that really mean on the ground, and how does one do that? I think is where we always run into kind of thing, and it's not an but they're depending on your orientation, folks have done it, haven't done it, and so and the level of it. Jane Reisman, who's on the call as well, and myself and one other person, we were kind of co-leading this 13-country massive. How do you do stakeholder engagement and impact investing for OECD? And we'll share those documents with you. And quite frankly, we didn't have there's no silver bullet to it, and it really depends on how you roll up your sleeves. But I think that to at least to make sure that folks that folks understand that your investors understand that. If you're going to do this work, I mean, really, impact investing is not for the faint of heart. That if you're either going to be in and you're not, and if you're going to be in, then that means you really got to have those conversations. And I think somehow making it clear. And I don't know if Jane has her hand up, but I think there's a bunch of stuff that's been happening around emergence and emergent learning that it really feeds into this. And Jane, I'm going to put you on the spot, and I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I think for Mike, I think that'd be important to kind of acknowledge that, and maybe that's already part of what you're thinking about.
No, I appreciate where all this went. I especially love the part about the elephant and getting all the perspectives in order to give some weight to that, which I think addresses your stakeholder piece as well, John. But I am really impressed with this emergent learning field that has been developing, which is complementary to developmental evaluation and adaptive management. I think the big difference, and I think it's going to be a huge ask for impact investors to accept this paradigm, but the big difference is in adaptive management, there's usually a pivot in order to reach some kind of target, whereas in emergent learning, it's an acceptance that complex systems change, there's unanticipated consequences, and it's an acceptance that the uncertainty about systems is something you need to keep looking at and learning from each action, and think about work as more a set of experiments that you keep iterating as opposed to an endpoint. And so that's another direction, which there's an emergent learning community that is really a vital community. Many evaluators have been joining it. It started out more though for strategic, came out of the Peter Senge work. Anyway, it is worth looking at, and I think it's very relevant to your system mapping piece. It's just the assumption that you're mapping it toward a more controlled, targeted goal versus emergence is based on a lot more uncertainty, if that makes any sense at all. Marilyn Darling is the main founder of the Emergent Learning, and she's based in Boston, as a matter of fact. Yeah. Thanks, John.
I see Rachel has her hand up.
Hi, everyone. I also missed introductions. Nice to see you, Kim. I come from the donor perspective. So I've worked with measurement and strategy design with international donors, but I'm really interested in looking at how the methods we use with donor-funded projects work in the impact investing space. One of the things as I've been exploring this space is that I find there's little budget to put towards this sort of effort. So I really loved everything in this presentation, and would love to see kind of the theory of change and systems mapping applied to these portfolios. But I think one of the things as you consider packaging it is to think about how to make the value proposition, because it is an investment in people power and research time to pull those systems maps together in a reliable and rigorous or semi-rigorous way. So I think that's really going to be the value proposition, whether that sits maybe on the organization side that's seeking the impact investment to have this clear map that shows that the injection at this point we anticipate will lead to these sorts of outcomes. So then the impact investor gets to just kind of plug and play, and they're not bearing the cost of that directly. Just some thoughts there.
Super helpful. Thank you.
I can jump in here if you don't mind. I'm hosting, so I don't think I can raise my hand. Thank you, Jackson. This is really, really interesting. What I find, and correct me if I'm wrong, my assumption was that the conversation around system mapping is to kind of replace theory of change and focus on a more complex sort of identifying of factors and players and so on. And I'm not sure if that's where your thesis is going, but what I find interesting is in private sector, we often do, market size, market fit, competitors, risks. We do ecosystem reviews during the strategy development process. And so that kind of sounds a little bit similar to, this is a lot more extensive. And what sometimes happens is people usually, just the sheer complexity of it will sort of scare people, and especially in investing space where you want to move pretty quickly and you want to invest and there's all these other factors. But it is important to understand, especially when you're looking at impact. What I'm wondering about is the logic model that we use is sort of to simplify all of that mess. And to sort of focus on, and especially in impact space, impact investing, let's focus on once we understand the ecosystem and the factors, let's focus on measuring these impacts that we can then demonstrate and find data for and so on. So I wonder if there is an interplay between ecosystem and the logic model that we can use both to sort of simplify that process and focus them on what's really important to measure and manage for.
Definitely. Totally resonates. And one of the things that we explore in the paper is if you introduce systems mapping as the step before the development of the logic model, that then you can then lift logic models out of your systems map where there are clear causal pathways, but then that logic model is based on an explicit consideration of external factors rather than having skipped that step to get to the logic model. So absolutely resonates, and that's something that we touch on in the paper. Super important, because those logic models serve important purposes for communication, and it's not always helpful to show people the complex systems map.
Yeah, I really appreciated your comments. And I really would like to learn more about what the social investment decision-making space looks like, because that's going to be really important to translating this language-wise, into something that is appetizing. But to these points, I think one of the things that you also could highlight with this is that one, if you're visualizing, to Jane's point, if you're visualizing, and somebody else's, it was also Michael's, this system and developing it together with a set of stakeholders, and you can be, prescriptive about your stakeholders, but you can do some research to make sure they're the right ones. And somebody else could do that, and they don't have to be very expensive. That visual process can do several things. It can help you develop that semi-qualitative model with more people involved, and therefore be a more accurate picture. And I'll get to the next point in a second. And then also increase the buy-in for whatever you're going to be doing, because those people, if you're getting the right influencers in the room who are affecting these groups, could actually be the people who are behind, excited about the fact that you're investing in this and could become your champions. So that's really a valuable aspect of this, one of the things that's relevant for this is that this is where evaluation and implementation, design and implementation, they merge. This is what should be happening. It shouldn't be that they're separated. They should be merged. And this is a mechanism you're doing for that. The other thing is that going through that process, as you're pointing out for the theories of change, I absolutely agree. Theories of change are going to be really important to simplifying this. But what are you measuring? You're going to get what you measure, right? Those leverage points for change that become more clear from the semi-quantitative method systems map will allow you to target your energy and your funds and your measurement to the things that are most important to measure and not to everything else. You want to be measuring those things that you think are going to be most important to moving the system along. And then, of course, you need to be testing those through the learning agenda. You need to be testing those to make sure that your assumptions were right, that those are the right leverage points. And then you knock them out if they weren't, and you put something else in its place. But this allows you to then limit what you have to measure, because one of the problems you see with these projects is they're trying to measure so many things, and it exhausts the data collectors, it exhausts the people, being asked, and it exhausts the people having to read the reports. So how do you simplify all of that? And this is one of the methods that I think really helps to, create a more effective logic model, theory of change, that then is a logic model.
Super, super helpful. And Kim, I'd love to follow up with you after the session and see if we can find some additional time, just because there's a lot in there. I know we have 7 minutes left, and
right. Yeah.
Make sure that I don't.
And I want to hear from others as well. So thank you. Thank you.
I'm also seeing Spencer asked 2 questions in the chat, which I don't want to look over. The first about tools and software. So the most popular software that I've seen for systems mapping is Kumu. I can put it in the chat here. But I also, in the course of the research for this project, came across this book that I can follow up with you, Spencer, and whoever else would like, by Barbrook, Johnson, and Penn, where they walk through a bunch of different systems mapping methods and index all of the different softwares and tools that folks use for the different approaches. So Kumu is the place that I see people use to start. I think also came up in that resource. So those are just a couple of the things that I've seen on question 1. And on question 2, it's an excellent question. And I think this was raised earlier about, I think it was Rachel raised the question of, how much investment are we calling for here with a system integrating systems mapping? And this is one of the places where the absence of concrete case studies in an investor context rears its head, and we're eager to figure out the answer to that question empirically rather than theoretically. So I can't really speak to, whether it's feasible in 2 to 4 weeks. I would imagine that the answer depends on the context first and foremost, and in some context maybe, in some contexts maybe not. But we're eager to see more examples so that we can think more concretely about that kind of question.
So Jackson, Jane, go ahead. You first.
I'm using my iPhone, so I can't find all the tools that I need. I think someone brought up, I'm not sure who it was, but someone just brought up a really important point about the complexity of it all and how easily it is to get overwhelmed. And the phrase that I hear often, I bet you it's familiar to many of you, is "you're making my head hurt." I can't tell you how often in a meeting, asking people to think about the work they're doing and then telling you, "You're making my head hurt." Like, what? So anyway, One of the things I love about emergent learning, and there's parallels in many, many other models, is that you get very clear on your line of sight. So if you did do a beautiful system map, as you're suggesting, Jackson, then it's easy for the investors to say, within this system, this is my line of sight. This is the practical, this is what we're working on right now. And so it's understanding you're part of a larger system and other things, but you're not responsible for it all. Versus what I think many of us experience is that the ambitions are great. You articulate this theory of change where you're going to achieve world peace and, you know, a perfect climate. So the idea of a line of sight is like one of my absolute favorites for, yes, we're operating in a complex system, but guess what? You're not on the hook for all of it, but be clear on what part you are on the hook for and pay attention to what unanticipated negative consequences might happen as well. So I just wanted to bring that up as well.
Yeah, Jane, I was just going to kind of, that you were saying various things I was thinking about too. And that just, I mean, the idea, Jackson, I'm sure these happens in other parts of the Impact Frontiers conversation about the big question is why you're doing what you're doing, right? And is it and that starts getting to what Jane just said about the line of sight. And you can control what you can control, but don't think that when you're thinking about your contribution, that there isn't a whole bunch of other stuff happening that, you know, don't let that frustrate you, but also don't have overblown expectations. And I think those are the pieces that are real to me when I hear these conversations. It's I forget the woman who was the investor, Rachel, I think it was you who were kind of saying this is a lot in terms of how an investor wraps their heads around it. And that's true. And it's kind of like the both and that you can control what you control in this, but there's so much you can't. So it's humbling. Thank you.
The humbling aspect was actually one of my favorite parts of this research. The idea that going through the systems mapping process may more often than not just show you that you can't anticipate what the impact of an investment is, and that's an important learning.
Mm-hmm. I think we're very close to an hour, Jackson. If there is any other ways people can get back to you or share their thoughts with you, maybe you want to let them know. And
yeah,
until when?
I mean, first I want to say, you know, thank you. This is super helpful, and I really appreciate all of your thoughtful engagement. And would love to continue the conversation with whomever is interested. In case I haven't made it abundantly clear, I'd love talking about and thinking about this topic. So if folks would be interested in speaking further, I'm putting my email in the chat. I leave Impact Frontiers for graduate school on July 7th, but I'll be staying on part-time. So I will retain that email. We are looking to publish the paper in the next couple of weeks. So eager to have conversations sooner rather than later, but always open to it. So thank you. I put my email in the chat and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.